Hello. Whoa. Welcome to part two of this pop-up course we're doing on Mitch Horowitz's wonderful book, One Simple Idea. I'm Tim. If for some reason you've never watched one of these videos before from my channel, the link to the playlist that's going to have all of the videos in this pop-up course, hopefully in order, is below in the description. I'll also put a link above for the playlist link for all parts of this course. This second video is, I'm going to be quoting from more from the chapter, Does It Work in One Simple Idea by Mitch Horowitz. And this is one of my favorite excerpts in the book. This is when we're really you're gonna, if you didn't already with the first video, with this video, you're gonna see where we are going with this pop-up course and why we're doing it. This is essential. But what I'm about to read, I think, is hugely important. Personally, I come from being someone. Let me just silence my phone. I come from, I guess you could say, a spiritual background that leaned towards mysticism. I was exposed and really, you could say, deeply involved with Zen Buddhism particularly, but also things like non-dualism. And then later on with kind of like more modern American mystical teachers, Byron Katie especially comes to mind. Like, that's my spiritual background. I lived at a Zen center for a year. I visited many Zen centers, did many Zen retreats, met with many different mystical teachers over the years, all before I got into these law of attraction ideas, which I did not find or didn't really get into at all until I was in my early 30s. And so my take on a lot of these manifesting concepts, whether we want to call them law of assumption concepts, law of attraction concepts, new thought concepts, whatever we want to call them, Mitch in this book intelligently, I think, just puts them all under the broad umbrella of positive thinking. When I came to these ideas, what drew me to them is there was some spiritual element without question, and some mystical undercurrents there. And I really liked that. But what drew me to them was the practical quality of a lot of the teachings. It was basically saying most of the stuff, you improve your inner life, you improve how you feel and how you look at the world, and your outer world will start to shift as well and change potentially. That really appealed to me. But my background was, and still always, it still is, always has been, in what I would call just like the deeper mysticism. And by that, I mean the stuff that's very hard to explain or make any kind of like concrete philosophy out of. It's so alive, right? And I've spoken about this a lot, particularly on my podcast. I'll put an episode link to a podcast we did a few years ago, I think, where I kind of, briefly just go over this about how law of attraction stuff, generally speaking, it uses grandiose language a lot of the time, kind of mystical sounding language a lot of the time. But at the end of the day, most of it seems to be pragmatic, while the really deep mystical teachings that many of you are familiar with, whether it be Zen or some of the Hindu or Sufi stuff, or more modern teachers like Byron Katie or Jan Fraser, or Nisargadatta Maharaj, Ramana Maharishi, people like that. What they're getting at, it's not like some overriding philosophy or a certain law or anything like that. It goes seemingly way beyond that. it's like pointing at something that is pointless. It's like pointing at the moon to recognize the truth, but it's a deep truth nonetheless. Very different in my eyes. There are commonalities, but not as many as a lot of people in the New Thought circles seem to think. And that's what Mitch is about to go over a little bit here in this excerpt from the book. And it's hugely important. Again, if you're new here and you're confused, you can contact me at info@radicalcounselor.com to clarify some of this stuff. Because if you're brand new, what I'm about to say might seem a little bit confusing, and it's hugely important. I also am still offering, brief free consultations for people if they have questions over Zoom. But yeah, let's get to what Mitch writes here. He's talking about highlighting a key difference between various creative thought movements, where we can say positive thinking, New Thought, law of attraction stuff, and traditional mysticism. It says to understand this difference in how it separates the mind power culture from the mystical traditions requires exploring the foundations of traditional mysticism. From this vantage point, we will be better able to confront the problems and possibilities of positive thinking. Okay, and then this section is called The Snake in the Road. Mitch writes, an identifiable mystical tradition appears within the teachings of all historic faiths, from Christianity to Sufism to Hinduism. This thread of mystical teaching has traditionally taught that human beings live in a state of ego illusion. In this state, we see gratification in the form of power, flattery, toys, sex, and money, unconsciously using these things to prop up the needs and hungers of the ego. For most of us, most of the time, desire fulfillment is our only experience of existence. Absent a connection of any sense of higher purpose or to some greater principle of life, our pursuit of possessions and attachments, both directly and indirectly, forms our primary feeling of aliveness. The momentary thrill of attainment is also our chief means of avoiding the fear that bodily death spells our complete annihilation. This critique of human life, as seen in comparable systems of mystical thought, seeks to explain our inability to loosen the bond of worldly attainments and to become aware of the greater truth of existence. Namely, that each individual is part of a larger whole and is a fragment of intelligent creation, or God. Only this awareness, so it is taught, can free us from both the repressed fear of death and the frantic consumption of daily life. Unaware of our true nature, however, we are stuck perpetually consuming, but never to satisfaction. Every gain, promotion, or advancement is a cause for further fear and craving, because our attachments are always prone to slipping away. And ultimately, at our life's end, they will slip away. In terms of human neurosis, the mystical tradition describes our psychology with parables such as the snake in the road, derived from a Vedic teaching, but found in many faiths. It goes this way. A traveler is walking down a road and suddenly gets frightened by the sight of a snake up ahead. The traveler fears he's going to get bitten. But on closer inspection, he sees that what he thought was a snake is only a harmless piece of rope. This is how the ego-driven man lives, constantly projecting his fears, then experiencing temporary solace, only to reimagine another snake just ahead. The mystical tradition doesn't deny the reality of suffering. Sometimes the snake is real. Rather, this tradition attempts to summon men and women to seek a state of awareness in which the barriers between the individual and whole, the perpetrator and the victim, the giver and the taker, can be seen to fade. From this perspective, ultimate reality reveals that the barriers we see between good and bad or sickness and health are themselves illusion. In all things, so the tradition teaches, man is at one with the whole, and everything figures usefully and necessarily into the order of existence. Let's not delude ourselves. At almost every moment of existence, this sense of oneness is impossibly distant, especially when we are facing an immediate need. And yet this higher truth can also reveal itself in moments of transcendent joy, such as the birth of a child, as well as in moments of true crisis, such as when confronting the untimely death of a loved one. Such tragedies drive us to the limits of our conditioned responses to life, as well as to the limits of our belief in our ability to change conditions. In times of tragedy or joy, when our human will is suspended, and when grief does not crush us or euphoria sweep us away, a more expansive view can settle over us. Again, this experience of oneness can appear hopelessly far away. Yet its occurrence is long recognized, not only in spiritual literature, but in the testimony of many modern individuals who experience such a state, albeit briefly, at times of acute need or intense joy. The Christian Science and New Thought views shares commonalities with the mystical tradition, but only up to a point. While Christian Science specifically denies the reality of illness, it also promises a change in conditions from illness, or, as Christian scientists put it, a revelation of truth. Christian Science testifies that if you realize higher truth in understanding the absolute permeation of all things by the beneficence of God, you will experience that goodness as freedom and true healing. In Christian Science, this often involves sickness yielding to health. In New Thought, it typically means poverty transforming to plenty. This change in outer circumstance is the central promise of the psycho-metaphysical philosophies. It is what distinguishes them from mysticism, transcendentalism, and various strands of existential and meaning-based psychology. The traditional mystical philosophies recognize the problem of illusion, but they also recognize the realness of suffering and evil, and they offer the same corrective, a higher or inner perspective that can dispel our conditioned ideas of separateness between the individual and the whole, and ultimately between deprivation and satisfaction. Many acolytes of New Thought and other spiritual therapeutic therapies would rush to signal their agreement with the mystical point of view. But do they really agree? They teach that evil is an illusion, but they nonetheless seek a measurable change in outer conditions. To call suffering an illusion, yet also demand that it bend to desired change, signals a core inconsistency in the mind power perspective. Rather than seeing all of worldly clamor as an illusion, New Thought defines whatever is discomforting as illusory and its opposite as a reflection of higher truth. Hence, New Thought and the mind power philosophies seek to rise above the world and consume its bounty at the same time. In a biting critique, historian Freeman Champney called New Thought a rationale of transcend your cake and eat it too. So that's a great excerpt. I hope some of you enjoyed it. I think a big issue for a lot of us, especially those of us who consider ourselves spiritual and mystically bent in the more traditional way, is that a lot of these law of attraction type of teachings present themselves as being mystical in their traditional way, when they are not. And I mean, this is something that needs to be looked at. And Horowitz just laid it out brilliantly here. generally speaking, we talk about like mysticism, what we usually think of mysticism, non-dualism, Zen, or any type of mystical strand, right? I was talking like modern people like Ramana Maharishi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Byron Katie, people like that. They offer the same corrective, to quote Mitch, a higher or inner perspective that can dispel our conditioned ideas of separateness between the individual and the whole, and ultimately between deprivation and satisfaction. That's the corrective for most spiritual, mystical stuff. That's not really, at least most of the time, the law of attraction corrective. Mitch puts it so well here. He said, New Thought defines whatever is discomforting as illusory and its opposite as a reflection of higher truth. Sounds great. Great marketing point, great selling point. But is it true? And why, all these wonderful mystical teachers, why do very few of them talk about manifestation in the way that these New Thought teachers do? My argument would be because they're two different things most of the time. Not to say there's no crossover, but there is not nearly as much of a crossover as a lot of these law of attraction type of teachers, law of assumption teachers like to suggest or say is so. We'll get into more, some of the troublesome implications of that next time in the next video. But this is really important to consider. And I'll end this video just by saying, I've mentioned it many times before, for me, when I feel deeply frustrated or disturbed, when I'm looking for spiritual comfort, when I'm looking for a deep truth, I basically never turn to these law of attraction teachings. Because they don't offer me a deep truth, usually. They offer me a pragmatic truth to potentially improve my life or improve the lives of others around me that I might want to help. But the nameless, deeper truth, like the kind of stuff I talk about in The Joy of Not Thinking, the kind of stuff that those teachers I mentioned all seemingly are pointing to, that's not in the New Thought law of attraction canon in my experiences. And it is in the traditional mystical canon. So that's worth considering. If you want deep spiritual advice, I would personally tell you to look elsewhere and not law of attraction teachings usually to find it. If you want advice to help improve your life practically and to feel more, you could say, fulfilled, including more spiritually fulfilled, law of attraction stuff's a great place to turn. Positive thinking, advice, like we always explore on this show, is a great place to turn. But the two are perhaps more different than similar. So yeah, we'll keep on going with the next video. And if you have any questions, like I said, or would like a free brief consultation, or are interested in coaching, or want more information on my books or on my podcast, I can be reached at info@radicalcounselor.com. Enjoy.